It's out there, universe doing its thing. Let's chill and get hot in the cold space, alright?
We're scanning, and I know this scan is gonna last. We're scanning, and I hope you like scanning too. Some people say there's no life in this universe. I say they don't know what life really is.
I don't know about you, but sometimes I find myself rooting for the asteroid. Not in a malicious, burn it all down way. More like an exhausted sigh from the soul. Like a cosmic version of pulling the fire alarm at work. And not because you want anybody hurt, but because then we can all go outside and sit in the grass for 20 peaceful, sane minutes and not talk about quarterly earnings or meal prep. There's something weirdly soothing about imagining it all ending, isn't there? I mean, civilization. You know, the meetings, the emails, the political arguments between people who can't even remember what they were mad about in the first place. The debt, the grind, the dating apps. Yes, the damn dating apps. It's not that I want the apocalypse. I just want a break. And total societal collapse is apparently the only thing left on the menu that might grant me one. And I'm sure some of you know how I feel. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about why so many of us quietly, probably guiltily, fantasize about the end of the world. And why we've all, at one point or another, had a fleeting thought like, if a solar flare knocks out the power grid, at least I won't have to go to my cousin's gender reveal barbecue. Because deep down, I think we're not really rooting for destruction. We're rooting for permission to stop pretending. Alright, so we are, for lack of a better phrase, tired as hell. And there's a word for it now. Doom scrolling. And it sounds cute, like a digital hobby or something. But really, it's 2 a.m. and you're in your underwear scrolling through mushroom clouds and genocide and political collapse and AI doomsday predictions and celebrity divorces, all with the same dead stare you use to microwave leftover pasta. So we've entered a phase of civilization I call apocalypse fatigue. And it's not that we don't believe the end is coming. It's that we've gotten so used to expecting it. We're now low-key annoyed that it hasn't happened yet. Like, if the planet's gonna burn, can we at least skip the part where I have to go to work tomorrow? And, this isn't just personal burnout. This is cultural burnout. You see it in the entertainment, zombies, pandemics, nukes, dystopias, and robot dogs. Let's not forget them. The end of the world, it isn't just a genre anymore. It's practically a lifestyle brand. And like we're binge watching societal collapse like it's comfort food. Oh, a new season of Black Mirror. Can't wait to be emotionally destroyed and spiritually hollowed out again. Though I do admit I enjoy Black Mirror. But here's a darker truth. We don't just watch the end of the world for fun. We romanticize it. And we kind of fantasize about it. And not because we're evil or broken or goth teenagers in adult bodies, but because collapse is starting to sound like a kind of freedom. It's the fantasy of the Great Reset. No more emails, no more awkward Zoom calls, no more productivity apps, no more soft launches on Instagram. Just silence, trees, fire, a bunker full of canned beans, and nobody asking you to circle back ever again. So, there's something seductive about the idea that we could all just let go. That we could stop pretending everything's fine. That the pressure to optimize, to be likable and build your brand, all of it might finally dissolve under a mushroom cloud or a solar flare. Or a really well-placed asteroid. Because if we're being truthful with ourselves, modern life feels like a joke someone forgot to tell the punchline to. We're buried under calendars, subscriptions, notifications, bills, side hustles, personal growth goals, dating apps, gym memberships, meal kits, therapy, burnout, eco-anxiety, student debt, social anxiety, career stagnation, and now we have AI coming to steal our jobs while simultaneously writing us poems about our mental health. And yet we're expected to smile through it and grind through it. Manifest abundance and hack your life and embrace the hustle and drink more water and take up cold plunges. And maybe you're just not trying hard enough, Frank. So, of course, the idea of collapse feels like relief. We don't want people to die. We just want a break. We want the machine to stop, and we want the game to end so we can finally stop pretending that we ever understood the rules in the first place. And this is why so many of us gravitate towards end of the world aesthetics. Rust and ruins and overgrown buildings, last person on earth vibes, all that. There's something hauntingly peaceful about imagining a world where human noise has been turned off. There's something almost inexplicably cozy about it. And I think some of you know what I mean. It's like just you, the wind, and the ghosts of a civilization that pushed too far and snapped. We're not fantasizing about fire, we're fantasizing about quiet, silence. Okay, so there's a version of the apocalypse in your head that's suspiciously tailored to your needs. And it's not nuclear winter. It's not roving bands of cannibals. It's more like everyone else disappears for a while. And society just calls it quits.
Surface scan complete.
You don't die. You just finally get to take a nap. And your rent disappears. Your inbox stops filling up with passive-aggressive messages from people who just wanted to follow up. And you don't have to explain your job to your relatives at Thanksgiving, and you don't even have to go to Thanksgiving. This version of the end times is just life, but a lot quieter and simpler. No FOMO, no social ladder, no more shoulds. It's just you and a cracked open can of peaches sitting by candlelight
Orbital
while
flight
the world
engaged.
burns quietly in the distance. And for the first time in your life, you don't feel behind, because there's no race left to lose. There's no burden to compete or succeed or any of the other bullshit trappings of modern society. And, you know, we're not crazy for wanting this or thinking this. We're tired and we're existentially overstimulated. You know, humans weren't built to absorb this much stress or this much information and noise and just general chaos.
Landing gear deployed.
You know, we evolved to worry about tigers, not TikTok algorithms. And yet, here we are. We're wired, twitchy, trying to meditate on a yoga mat while our brain quietly screams, "The ice caps are melting and you're still single." So the fantasy of collapse becomes a kind of perverse therapy. And a pressure valve, maybe. The only scenario where you're allowed to stop trying so hard without feeling like a failure, because if the world ends, well, it's not your fault. You didn't answer that email or start your small business or get married. The grid went down and you win by default. So that's the secret allure. Total absolution. You know, the apocalypse as a comic get out of jail free card. You know, no more career, no more reputation, no more grind set. You're no longer a brand. You're basically a person again. Maybe a dirty, stinking, unshaved, slightly feral person, but you're present. And The irony is that in this fantasy, the end of the world is less horrifying than the continuation of the one we're living in. A real nightmare is waking up every day and logging into a system that feels less and less human and pretending it's fine. Pretending you're fine. You know, end stage corporate crony capitalism is like a treadmill with a brick wall at the end, and we're all jogging towards it with a smoothie in one hand and a therapy podcast in the other, trying to stay aligned while the ground gives out beneath us. So maybe it makes sense that we dream of fire and flooding and whatever else, you know, or the lights going out, not because we want death, but because maybe we want permission to rest. Alright, so there's a reason post-apocalyptic shows are everywhere, and that they're very popular. You know, it's not just entertainment, it's a form of therapy. You know, we stream collapse like it's comfort food. You know, zombies, nuclear war, viral pandemics, AI revolts. You know, it's a buffet of global disaster. And we binge it. You know, not because we want to die, but because we want to imagine what it'd be like to finally live without emails and debt and without being socially obligated to like your coworkers' vacation photos. So, in The Walking Dead, nobody's worried about car insurance. And in The Road, nobody's returning texts. And in Station 11, people are performing Shakespeare in airports instead of scrolling Instagram while their brains rot out of their heads. You know, I mean, it's bleak, but it's honest. And, you know, compared to the dissonance of pretending our current system makes sense, and sometimes honesty, even in ash and rubble, feels like a relief. There's a reason why people say they'd rather fight zombies than go to work. You know, you look at the screen and you think, okay, yeah, you know, the world's ended and the cities are on fire and everyone's slowly losing their humanity. But at least they're not posting motivational quotes on LinkedIn bios. And, it's not just movies, it's memes and TikToks, and it's jokes about society with 300,000 likes under them. I mean, collapse humor has become the background radiation of the internet. We don't even flinch anymore when someone posts. And maybe the asteroid should hit. LOL. And, we nod. And we laugh. And we hit like and we just keep on scrolling. Because deep down, we're all a little soothed by the idea that if everything burns down, at least we're not the only ones falling apart. Apocalypse is like a great equalizer. Alright, but here's the thing. We forget while we're chuckling at dystopian memes and buying end-of-the-world candles on Etsy. Some people are already living it. In places like Gaza, the apocalypse isn't a quirky vibe. It's not aesthetic. It's not a meme. It's real. Buildings collapse for real. Children scream for real. There's no Netflix buffering wheel between explosions. When your entire neighborhood is leveled by a drone strike, you're not fantasizing about societal collapse. You're buried under it. In Ukraine, families live underground for weeks. Not to pretend, they're in a bunker like Fallout, but because air raid sirens mean their apartment might not exist in 10 minutes. And there's many other places around the world in similar situations. Parts of Sudan, Syria, Yemen, hell, even right here in forgotten American towns that have been hollowed out by opioids and hopelessness. There are people living in slow motion devastation. Food insecurity, displacement, violence, corruption, economic abandonment. The apocalypse isn't pending, it's already arrived. And not, with a movie trailer. No synth soundtrack, just dust, loss, and real silence. and not the nice kind. So yeah, we joke about wanting the world to end so we can finally breathe. But for millions, the world really already ended. And they're still breathing through it anyway. Now, that doesn't mean your feelings are invalid. But it does mean we should hold our fantasy with some humility. Because while we romanticize collapse, others are really just trying to survive it. In fact, some of the most shared memes on the internet are apocalypse fantasies wrapped in punchlines. Me looking at Zillow listings for lighthouses with no internet access, and when the world ends, but your rent finally stops. We're joking, but we're not. And pop culture, it gives us a safe way to touch the void. To imagine escape, not from life, but from the pressure of performing life correctly. From the pressure of needing to have a 5-year plan when we can barely afford groceries. From the slow psychic paper cut of being told this is all normal when it's clearly not. Okay, so here's the thing. We've been telling ourselves these stories since the beginning. Stories about flood myths, raptures, end times, etc., etc. Every culture has its version of the reset button. Because apparently even thousands of years ago, people looked around and thought, this can't be it, right? This can't be the best we can do. So we imagine the fire and the flood, the great collapse. Because on some level, it feels like the only way anything will ever actually change. The truth is, a lot of us are barely holding it together. And, I don't mean that in a dramatic, screaming on the bus kind of way. More like muted emotional decay. low battery mode. The kind of exhaustion that doesn't go away with sleep, because it's not really about sleep. It's about futility. You do what you're supposed to do. You go to work, pay your bills, answer emails you don't care about from people you don't respect. Pretend you're passionate about delivering value while slowly Googling things like how to disappear into the woods without dying. You're not suicidal, you just want out. Not really out of life, but out of this life. One that demands too much and gives back too little. The one where you're constantly being optimized, surveyed, monetized, manipulated, and more or less guilt-tripped into believing that if you're not happy, it's your fault. So, yeah, when you picture the apocalypse, it's not about watching the world burn, it's about
Landing gear deployed.
watching your to-do list burn and watching the debt disappear and watching the calendar wipe itself clean. So, for once, there are no expectations. Nobody's asking what your purpose is. And nobody's chasing personal brand synergy on TikTok while their soul silently bleeds out. You're just surviving. Or maybe just being. So the end of the world, for some of us, looks less like fire and brimstone and more like a folding chair under a dead tree, silence, and the total absence of notifications. Romanticizing the apocalypse is less about destruction and more about permission to stop pretending you're okay and stop performing a role. And maybe to stop being emotionally responsible for a society that abandoned you a long time ago. Because, let's admit it, nobody prepared you for this. You weren't raised to thrive in a hyper-capitalist dopamine casino, and you weren't meant to be accessible 24/7 or designed to maintain 7 social media platforms while also being emotionally available, mentally resilient, and financially stable on a wage that doesn't even really cover rent. And now look, you may be a little bit broken, but the system is a lot more broken. And collapse fantasies are just your brain's way of saying, hey man, maybe it's not me. Maybe this really is just too much. So you imagine an ending. You know, not because you want death, but because you want peace, actually. And you don't know any other way to get it. Alright, so here's a weird thing nobody tells you. You can want the world to end and still love parts of it. You know, the two aren't mutually exclusive. You can want to torch the systems that hollowed you out and still get misty-eyed over your friend's laugh. Or the way the sunlight hits that one cracked window in your kitchen at 4:23 p.m. in the month of June. Or maybe your old dog still thumps his tail when you say his name, even though his legs barely work anymore, sadly.
Landing gear deployed.
You know, apocalypse fantasies aren't always about annihilation. Sometimes they're about subtraction. Like, what would be left if we removed all the noise? You know, the false urgency and the unpaid emotional labor of pretending you're fine in a world built for profit margins, not people. I mean, what if we destroyed the stage and scrapped the performance and just sat in the rubble for a while? You know, like you might actually start to feel something. Like your own thoughts, silence, breath, you know, like actual presence, and not the kind that gets commodified into a 10-step mindfulness app. You know, this is where the fantasy turns, where the apocalypse becomes less about collapse and more about clarity. You know, you get to ask, what am I without this job? This phone? This identity I perform so I can stay employed and likable. I mean, it's terrifying. You know, but it's also kind of freeing. You know, you stop being a product and you start being a person again. You know, one who gets to say no. One who doesn't have to network or explain or convince or promote or fucking sell something. You know, one who's just alive in a body under a sky on a planet that's probably trying to kill you, but at least it's honest about it. You know, maybe that's what we're really after here. You know, not destruction or drama, just honesty. In a world that matches the emotional weight of what we're carrying. You know, one that says, yeah, you're tired. Yeah, this is totally absurd. You're not crazy, you're just awake. And once you're there, on the other side of the fantasy, you're staring into the scorched horizon of what's left. You know, you might notice something strange growing in the ashes. It's not hope exactly, it's more like space. Possibility, freedom, the kind that doesn't require branding or bullet journaling or spiritual hashtags. Just space to feel and rest, to imagine something better. All right. So the world didn't end again. Another Monday, another missed meteor. You know, the grid didn't collapse. Your boss is still emailing you at 9:42 p.m. And that vague hope for a righteous inferno remains just out of reach. So now what? What do you do with all this gnawing, unspeakable hunger for obliteration? This quiet, shame-laced desire to just opt out of the simulation. I think you get honest. That's what. You sit down, maybe on your floor, or in the parking lot of a Walgreens at dusk, eating trail mix and contemplating the futility of your LinkedIn profile. I actually deleted mine a year ago. Never used it. And you say, all right, if I can't destroy the world, maybe I can start by destroying a few lies I'm living. Because that's what this is really about. All right, lie number 1. You have to be productive to matter. Lie number 2. Your worth is defined by how useful you are to the system. Lie number 3. If you just buy the right planner or the right protein powder or a guided breathwork course, you'll finally feel okay. These are really viruses masquerading as values. And, you can stop participating. You can delete the app and call in sick. Ignore the hustle cult whispering in your ear. You can also start by doing tiny things that feel a little bit like sanity. Like standing barefoot in the grass for 11 minutes. Not because it's a wellness hack, but because your nervous system forgot what Earth feels like. Like letting a single real emotion land without immediately repackaging it for social media. And if you want to go nuclear, here's a radical move. Talk to someone like a human. Ask them what they're afraid of, not what they do, and not what they've been up to. Just what they're afraid of. It might be kind of a weird ask, but and then try to tell them yours. 2 people, no brands, no monetization, no agenda, and just mutual existence in a chaotic, slowly burning world, basically. You may not get the apocalypse you wanted, but you can still dismantle a few things. Silently from the inside. Like a friendly saboteur, you don't have to fix the world. You don't have to fix yourself. You just have to stop lying. That alone is, I think, revolutionary. Okay, so here we are. No mushroom cloud, no EMP blasts, or AI uprising. Unless you count your phone auto-correcting I love you to I live you, which is honestly more accurate anyway. Still, something in you aches for an ending of sorts. And not just the world's ending, but an ending to all this trying. This endless effort, the expectations, the fake smiles, the pressure to look like you're thriving while quietly Googling how to disappear, but legally. Guilty as charged. Maybe the apocalypse we wanted wasn't really about destruction. Maybe it was about silence. The relief of no longer being expected to do or be anything impressive. The great cosmic permission slip to just exist. And maybe the reason it hurts so much to keep going is because we were never really meant to live like this. Chronically overstimulated and spiritually malnourished, socially fragmented, and deeply terrified to being bored or alone with our thoughts. Maybe the real dystopia is this performance of normalcy that we're all doing day in, day out. And the dead-eyed, I'm fine when, you say you're clearly unraveling inside. The 7-hour screen time reports, or the fact that your neighbors have names you'll never know because you live in a pod and you get your needs met by apps. Alright, here's a little secret. The world doesn't have to end for things to change. You don't have to burn your life down to feel peace. You just have to stop trying to live someone else's version of meaning. You can romanticize the end all you want. But if you really want peace, start subtracting. Subtract the noise, the striving, and subtract the fake urgency, the social climbing, and all the endless comparisons, the productivity hacks, the sterile, spiritually bankrupt rituals of modern life. And once you do, you might find something underneath, something alive.
Scoping complete.
Something that was there before you learned how to pretend. Maybe something that's not very impressive on paper, but it feels real. Like a quiet of a Tuesday night with no notifications, Like knowing one person who actually gets you, laughing until you cry about absolutely nothing. You're not needing a catastrophe to give yourself permission to breathe. You don't need the world to end. You just need a reason to stay. And sometimes that reason is really simply this. You're allowed to exist without fixing anything. And that, I think, is the most rebellious thing you can do in a world that demands your endless improvement. So, go ahead, romanticize the apocalypse. I mean, if it helps you survive, but just don't forget surviving quietly and gently and authentically is its own kind of beautiful ruin. Thanks for watching. So, the other night, I found myself arguing with a toaster on Reddit. Okay. It wasn't technically a toaster, at least I hope not. It was an account that may or may not have been run by a person or a bot, or a very sarcastic AI with abandonment issues. It was hard to say. But somewhere between the flat earth memes and a slideshow of AI generated Renaissance Muppets, it hit me. I'm losing the ability to determine what's real anymore. And I have a feeling that many of you feel the same. And personally, the scariest part, I don't think I'm supposed to. Because it's looking like we've built a world online and off where reality is less of a shared experience and more of a choose your own delusion simulator. You can scroll through 5 different versions of the same event, all of them confidently wrong in their own special way. And the algorithm just hands you the one that makes you feel the most correct, or the most outraged, or ideally both. And this isn't just digital noise. It's a full-blown metaphysical crisis. And that's what we're dealing with now. Plato would have taken one look at Twitter and set himself on fire. And ultimately, the line between fiction and nonfiction is not just blurred, it's been deep-faked. I mean, it's been repackaged,
System scan complete.
monetized, and it's been served to you with a "Did you like this content?" pop-up. So here we are. Welcome to the uncanny valley of consensus reality, where nothing feels true, but everything still somehow hurts.
System scan complete.
So let's back up a bit. Before
Fuel scooping
we
complete.
trusted an app to explain the universe and an algorithm to save our souls, we had philosophers. You know, people who sat around in robes asking questions like, what is real? And how do we know we're not just brains in a vat? Which was way ahead of its time, considering how many of us now live in a vat called the comment section. So metaphysics, the branch of philosophy dealing with
Fuel scooping complete.
the fundamental nature of reality, it goes way back, like ancient Greece back. You know, before brunch, before capitalism, and before people needed digital detoxes. And one of the OGs of metaphysics was Plato, who gave us the allegory of the cave. And if you haven't heard of it, it's basically this metaphor where a group of people are chained up in a cave, forced to watch shadows on a wall. And the shadows are all they've ever known. So to them, that's reality. But then one day, one of the people breaks free and stumbles out of the cave and sees the actual world. Sunlight, trees, birds, probably a decent coffee shop, and realizes, oh shit, I've been living in a simulation. Then he goes back and
Fuel scooping complete.
he tries to tell the others, excitedly of course, and they laugh at him, or they kill him, or they just download him or downvote him into oblivion. Because people don't like having their reality questioned. Especially not if it's the only one they've ever known. Now, I should add that Plato wasn't just talking about literal shadows. He was describing perception, belief, and the terrifying idea that we might mistake illusion for truth. Sound familiar? We used to need caves for that metaphor. And now we've got screens. high resolution, pocket-sized caves that feed us shadows in the form of headlines, highlight reels, AI-generated scandals, or that fake video where Zuckerberg blinked like a normal human. Obviously a dead giveaway. Okay, so here's something
System scan complete.
to ponder. When we're trying to decide if something is real, and your body reacts to an illusion the same way it reacts to reality, does it even matter that it's fake? I mean, if a deep fake gives you the same emotional reaction as the real person would have, are you still being manipulated? I mean, think about that. If your sense of reality is hijacked daily, are you even you anymore? And ultimately, how much does that really matter? But that's something you'll need to take some time to ponder. So these are metaphysical questions, and most people are trying to answer them with a brain that's been rewired by 10 hours of screen time per day and trauma. So the problem is we've mistaken the representation of things for the things themselves. And this isn't new. Philosophers have been warning about this stuff forever. For example, Descartes. He's the one who had that whole "I think, therefore I am" bit, which was his way of trying to pin down what can actually be known for sure. So he questioned everything: the body, the senses,
System scan complete.
the world around him, until finally the only thing he was sure of was that something was doing the doubting. You know, if Descartes lived today, he'd probably be having a nervous breakdown over whether the Amazon review he just read was written by a person, a bot, or a guy in Bulgaria being paid $2 an hour to pretend he loves portable bidets. So then you got another philosopher, David Hume, who he basically said, hey, maybe causality isn't even real.
Scoping complete.
Maybe we just expect the sun to rise tomorrow because it always has. And it doesn't mean it has to. And Hume would have absolutely thrived on Twitter. Posting deadpan observations about how nothing can truly be known, and then rage-liking cat videos for 4 hours. Which, by the way, yours truly has been known to do. Okay, but maybe the most relevant metaphysician of our current mess, Immanuel Kant, who argued that we don't see the world as it is. We see it as it appears to us. Basically through a filter, a framework, or
System scan complete.
like a mental operating system. Basically Kant said reality is mediated, and friend, let me tell you, if he'd seen what we've done with filters and frameworks, he'd choke on his powdered wig. Okay. So this is where we cue in the guy who wasn't technically a philosopher, but probably understood modern metaphysical anxiety better than any of them. Philip K. Dick. And if you don't know him, he was a science fiction writer and a man riddled with paranoia, amphetamines, and metaphysical dilemmas. Basically, the literary equivalent of a Reddit thread in human form. But he was also a visionary. Decades before deepfakes and AI-generated girlfriends, he was writing about identity, memory, and the terrifying unreliability of perceived reality. So his work is basically metaphysics on mushrooms. In books like Ubik, A Scanner Darkly, and you may have heard of this one, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? He asks things like, what makes us human? Is reality a shared experience or just a personal hallucination? Can you trust your memories, your perceptions, your sense of self? And spoiler, probably not. And of course, his work led to the film Blade Runner, which wasn't just about androids and neon rain. It was about what it means to be real in a world full of artificial everything. Artificial people, memories, emotions, A future where the line between real and fake has eroded so completely that even the characters don't know which side they're on. So Blade Runner wasn't just a futuristic film noir that foretold our future. It felt like our future. Moody, lonely, drenched in advertising and existential dread. Kind of like scrolling Instagram during a blackout. But here's the part that really punches us in the collective teeth. This inability to tell what's real isn't just messing with your sense of self while you scroll at 2 a.m. It's actually bleeding into our physical lives. It's into our conversations, our elections, classrooms, and even our courts. There used to be this idea that even if we disagreed on values, we could at least agree on the facts. You could believe taxes should be high or low, but at least we all agreed that 2 + 2 = 4. Now we're in an era where math is a conspiracy and people are getting into fistfights over whether the sky is blue or being gaslit by the deep state. And, this collapse of shared reality is the real metaphysical crisis. Not in a pretentious philosophy class sort of way, but like a civilization might stop functioning kind of way. That's how serious this is. Science undermined by conspiracy. Education now viewed as indoctrination. Journalism rebranded as propaganda. Depending on which flavor of algorithm-fed outrage you prefer. And politics, it's now less about policies and more about which simulation you've decided to live in. So some people don't just deny the facts, they choose entirely different realities, alternative facts, complete with their own heroes, villains, and alternate timelines. They don't want to argue over how to interpret the truth. They want to argue over what truth is or whether it should exist at all. And this isn't just dumb. It's very dangerous. Society can't function without some consensus reality. We all have to agree on something. So at this point, we're living in a world where everything is up for debate, except the fact that reality should matter. And when people can no longer agree on what's real, they stop being able to solve real problems. Climate change, pandemics, income inequality, genocide. All of it gets reduced to performance art in a theater where the stage itself is fake. And somehow we all just keep playing our roles. Because opting out feels lonelier than playing along with the glitch. So here we are, spinning inside this recursive funhouse of illusion where reality is no longer agreed upon. It's voted on, marketed, monetized, or ignored. And honestly, this shit is exhausting. Because it's not just the macro level breakdown. It's the personal toll. The low-grade panic that comes from never being totally sure what's real anymore. The emotional fatigue of being gaslit by your own timeline. And the quiet horror of watching your grip on the world and yourself dissolve into a blur of simulated stimuli and contradictory narratives. We used to talk about the search for truth like it was noble. Now it's a punchline, a meme, a quaint boomer fantasy, like cable TV or healthy marriages. Reality, it used to be something, and now it's just another setting in your preferences tab. Now look, I'm not gonna sit here and pretend like I've got some neat little 5-step plan to detox your metaphysical confusion. This isn't hacks for mental clarity 101. This is what the fuckery on a cosmic scale. comic too, I guess. But there are a few things I think can help. And start with number one, slow the hell down. The faster the content, the less time your brain has to engage with it. Pause, breathe, read a whole article, watch a full documentary, read books, watch videos without a million edits. Don't scan or skip. Hell, finish this video. You might be the only one who does. Alright, number two. Get back in your body and reconnect to the physical.
System scan complete.
Touch dirt. I don't mean the dirt in your apartment, I mean the dirt outside. Stand on the grass barefoot. Talk to someone in real life. Pet a dog, a cat, whatever, ride a horse. Stare at some physical art. Anything that reminds you your nervous system. Reminds you that your nervous system. And that you're not a mammal. Not a manic data processor in a dopamine cage. Alright, number three. Practice what I call slow knowing. We've trained ourselves to react instantly to everything.
System scan complete.
News, outrage, trends. But metaphysical clarity doesn't come at scroll speed. So try to give yourself space to not know. Try to hold conflicting thoughts. To feel the itch of uncertainty without scratching it with some AI generated answer. Reality it's slow. It takes time. Sit with it. Cultivate inner stillness. It doesn't have to be in a Zen monk kind of way unless that's your thing, that's fine. But in the sense that you need some quiet space inside yourself that the noise can't penetrate. A place where you remember that you are real, even when the world forgets how to be. Okay. Number four. Make things with your hands.
System scan complete.
Digital life is all inputs. But making things with your hands, like cooking, drawing, playing a musical instrument, carving a piece of wood until it becomes something other than wood. This gives you a sense of tangible cause and effect. You know, realness, agency. It reminds you that you're not just a consumer of illusions, but a creature in a physical world. Even if what you make sucks. I mean, especially if it sucks. Okay. Number 5. Cultivate little communities. So, the internet promised global connection and gave us hyper atomization instead. And maybe the antidote isn't more content, it's smaller, weirder, realer groups. Find, I don't know, a book club, a quirky independent cafe where no one has an online following, a Dungeons and Dragons group that meets in a basement, a hiking or running or meditation group, or I don't know, how about one of those local groups that cleans up parks and green spaces in cities. You know, try some volunteering. And I know, I get it, it's hard to break out of the introversion, especially those of us who are introverts. But small communities they're like metaphysical compounds. You know, they might smell a little weird, but they grow truth. So, yeah. You know, we're in a metaphysical crisis. And it is getting worse, and it's probably going to get worse with AI coming in. And, you know, it's not because of philosophers or thinkers, you know, ancient riddles, but because the basic human need to understand the world has been hijacked by a digital economy that profits from confusion. But, you know, here's a weird little comfort. You're not crazy for feeling disoriented. You know, the world really has changed.
System scan complete.
And reality really is glitching in various ways. And if you feel like you're losing your mind, that might mean you're still aware and still sane. So maybe the trick isn't to find one true reality. It's just to stop letting fake ones own you or control you. Control your perception. Because, you know, in a world where almost nothing is real anymore, choosing to stay grounded might be the most rebellious thing we can do. There's a sickness that's become so normalized and expected now that most people just call it life. No one prescribes pills for it, but everyone's medicating anyway. And you can feel it when you walk into a grocery store with only $14 and 3 days left until payday. Or when you stare at your phone wondering why the rich are joyriding in space while you're Googling how to fix a broken filling with super glue. This is what it looks like when inequality stops being a statistic and starts being a sentence. Okay, here we go. We're living through what I think might be the most elegant scam in history. This is a heist so slow and subtle, but so common that we started blaming ourselves for being robbed. And it's not just corporate capitalism, it's feudalism with Wi-Fi. They just added some apps and gave it a facelift. So Yanis Varoufakis calls it techno-feudalism, and you've probably heard this term lately. And this is generally the idea that the modern elite class didn't just get rich, they rewrote the rules. So in the old system, you made things and you sold them. And now you just rent the platform. You pay the toll. Amazon owns the store, and in some respects, it owns the road to the store and to your house, and you own the stress and maybe an inspirational mug that mocks you every morning. So tech giants aren't competing in a free market. They are the market. They're the landlords of the digital realm, and we're the peasants in emotional debt, paying rent with our attention and our data, our dignity, and the occasional selfie in portrait mode. And it's not that racism and sexism and all the other isms have vanished. Far from it. But this new version of the class war, it's more insidious because it co-ops every other division and it turns them into clickbait.
Scoping complete.
It monetizes outrage like it's oxygen. It feeds us stories about who's offending who, or who's canceling who, or who used the wrong pronoun, or who ate the wrong salad, all while quietly relocating trillions of dollars to the top 1%. You know, bread and circuses, same as it ever was. But now the bread is moldy, and the circus is live streamed through TikTok influencers arguing with AI therapists. Okay, now this is the part where it gets historical. You know, we've done this before in our past, over and over again. The French Revolution didn't start because someone forgot to be polite. It started because a bloated aristocracy squeezed the working class so hard that heads had to roll. Literally. The Spartacus slave revolt was basically the same story, just a lot earlier. A bunch of poor bastards that were pushed way past the breaking point. You know, Rome called it treason, and history called it a tantrum of the oppressed. Now, let's fast forward to the Gilded Age of the USA, where the richest men weren't just rich, they were basically godlike. Rockefeller, Carnegie, Vanderbilt, you've heard these names. They had more power than some governments. While kids were working 14-hour days in coal mines, these guys were busy deciding whether to buy another railroad or just rename a city after themselves. And then came the crash. 1929, the Great Depression, and this is when the system finally tripped over its own greed and face planted. Millions were unemployed, banks collapsing, suicide rates spiking, and it didn't have to happen. But when you concentrate wealth long enough, you concentrate collapse. Alright, so the economist Thomas Piketty has spent most of his career proving with some conviction that this is the cycle. Capital grows faster than wages, inequality rises, society cracks, and then eventually one of two things will happen: a revolution or a reset, heads or handouts. Joseph Stiglitz, another heavyweight, says inequality isn't just bad for the poor, it's bad for the economy itself. It gums up growth. It kills innovation, and creates a system where the only thing that trickles down is anxiety and resentment. And now we've entered a phase where billionaires aren't just rich. They're gods with private satellites and biotech labs. You know, they're buying citizenships, launching rockets, prepping bunkers in New Zealand while telling you to keep manifesting abundance. Imagine if the pharaohs of Egypt came back, but instead of pyramids, they built social media platforms. And then they made the slaves argue with each other about gender roles and gluten. Okay, so what the hell is techno-feudalism? Sounds kind of like something you'd find in a rejected Doom sequel, right? But according to economist and former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis, it's not sci-fi metaphor. It's where we actually are now. Alright, so Varoufakis argues that we've slipped into a post-capitalist system and not in the utopian, we've transcended money and now live in a synthwave eco-commune kind of way. No, this is darker. In techno-feudalism, markets don't really run things anymore. Platforms do. And what this means is that the old capitalism ran on competition. You made stuff, you sold stuff, and you tried to outdo your competitor. And now, try competing with Amazon. Try selling art without crossing Meta's toll bridge. Or try reaching people without paying the social media algorithm tax. You don't compete anymore. You submit. You bend the knee to your techno-feudal overlord. Okay, so in the Middle Ages, you didn't own the land. The Lord did. You just got to survive on it as long as you paid rent and harvested crops and bowed at the right times. These days, the land is digital. The lords are tech giants. And instead of grain, we hand over our data and our attention, our souls wrapped in 60-second content with royalty-free music. And the harvest
Down by 50%.
is harvested from us. So what that means is Facebook owns your memories, Google owns your thoughts, Apple owns your wallet, and you get a personalized user experience. And an existential void deep enough to park Elon Musk's ego. And speaking of him, billionaires used to at least pretend they weren't cartoon villains. Now they cosplay as Tony Stark while treating workers like NPCs in a side quest about quarterly earnings. They talk about colonizing Mars while entire zip codes can't even afford insulin. So in this brave new world, capital doesn't mean land or factories anymore. It means platforms. Whoever owns the digital infrastructure owns the future. And everyone else is just renting their place in the feed. So here's the fun part of inequality. And by fun, I mean soul decaying and democracy eroding. When the wealth gap grows wide enough, it becomes a chasm deep enough to swallow the truth. And in that vacuum, you can amplify and exploit all sorts of distractions, such as racism, sexism, culture wars, identity panic, and so forth. Because the more people feel powerless, the more desperate they become to matter somewhere, somehow. And if you can't climb the economic ladder, you start to look for someone else to step on. And that's how class war gets rebranded as culture war. That's how people end up yelling at baristas for using whole milk instead of realizing that their landlord is a human PayPal button, siphoning half their income for a roach-infested shoebox. It's misdirection and manipulation. Like watching people on the Titanic argue about pronouns while the deck tilts into the ice-cold Atlantic.
Alright, time to end the stream right now. A friend called and he's coming to visit here. But anyways, this was just once again scanning, and that's kind of the spirit of this whole journey. But yeah, I think it will last 4 months, and this was just first month. so I'll be seeing you around. Right on, keep cool and be well.